Hello, I'm Eric Huang. You're listening to Saint Podcast, a podcast about the always fascinating and often controversial lives of the saints. This is a history and culture podcast that traces the origins of morality tales of the saints, or hagiographies, through queer and feminist stories, legends and lore, art history, and pop culture. It's a Sin is a special episode created in collaboration with the York Art Gallery. It's inspired by an exhibition curated by Dr Joost Joustra called Sin, organised by the National Gallery London with York Museums Trust. The exhibition explores the theme of sin through a collection of artworks, spanning a medieval depiction of demons consuming the soul of a sinner, to old masters' paintings of saints and other divine figures, and provocative contemporary works that confront the assumptions we all make about the concept of sin and the sinners who commit them. This is It's a Sin, a special Saint Podcast episode about the history of sin. The concept of sin is pervasive in Western culture. Most judicial systems around the world are based on age-old beliefs surrounding sin and atonement, crime and punishment. The Christian doctrine of sin is derived from a much older Jewish tradition. It comes down to us today, however, in a very different shape than the form it took at the religion's inception. In fact, the concept of sin has always been quite vague, ever evolving through the centuries as it continues to do so today. Actions deemed as unforgivable sins in the 21st century, such as slavery or child labor, for example, were considered necessary evils, sometimes a God-given right, only centuries ago. Conversely, many sins of the past have been normalized today. Divorce, same-sex relationships, premarital sex, all were considered sins in the past, often unthinkable, but are by and large inconsequential in 2023. At least in pockets in the West. This episode is by no means a definitive guide. The topic of sin could fill an entire podcast of its own. Instead, we will take a tour through time to explore how the concept has changed in the last 2,000 years or so through the work of saints and scholars, clerics, monarchs, and artists. Let's start at the beginning. For the purposes of this Saint Podcast episode, the beginning is Judaism, the religion Christianity came from. In Judaism, sin is the violation of the mitzvot, also known as the Law of Moses. 613 commandments from the holy text, the Torah, which are a mix of 248 acts people must perform, and 365 that are prohibited. In Judaism, sin is a part of life. Humans are imperfect, therefore sin is inevitable and expected. For Christians, sin is avoidable. It's not easy to avoid every temptation of sin, but every faithful Christian must strive to do so. In the earliest sacred literature, sins are described as a burden. Recall the expression, the weight of sin, and think about the weight of guilt, a heavy conscience. Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart, is a great example of sin and the associated guilt as a burden. The story opens to an unnamed narrator's confession of killing an old man the narrator lives with. The motive is only that the victim has a vulture-like eye that disturbs the narrator so much that it drives them to kill someone whom they profess to love. The police soon come knocking because a neighbor hears a scream. It's then that the burden of guilt drives the narrator insane. They're convinced they can hear the beating heart of the victim who's buried under the floorboards, right under the spot where the cops have been invited to sit and chat. The burden of guilt terrorizes the narrator, compelling them to confess to murder. The Jewish book Leviticus from the Torah, which also forms part of the Christian Old Testament, describes an ancient ritual in which a bull and a goat are sacrificed on the Day of Atonement. This holy day is also called Yom Kippur. In antiquity, the purpose of the day was to cleanse the Temple of Jerusalem, the priesthood, and the people of sins, both known and unknown. A second goat was kept alive, then sent into the desert to carry away the sins just cleansed from the temple and the people. Here is Leviticus chapter 16, verse 21 to 22. Then Aaron shall lay both his hands on the head of the live goat, and confess over it all the iniquities of the people of Israel, and all their transgressions, all their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and sending it away into the wilderness by means of someone designated for the task. The goat shall bear on itself all their iniquities to a barren region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. Aaron is a prophet, the elder brother of Moses. He transfers the sins of the previous year onto the goat as a burden to carry away and neutralize in the wilderness. The chosen goat is called the scapegoat. This is the root for the expression scapegoat. According to Gary Anderson's brilliant book, Sin, A History, sometime between the 5th to 2nd century BCE, the metaphor of sin as a burden the sinner must carry until it's lifted and forgiven by God transforms into a financial transaction. In the centuries following the creation of the books in the Torah, sin becomes a negative balance, a debt to be paid back to God upon death. The idea is evident in sayings like the wages of sin. Penance, prayer, and almsgiving, essentially good deeds, are tallied against the bad ones to determine if the balance sheet of one's life is overall negative or positive. Saint Michael the Archangel, a saint and divinity recognized by all of the Abrahamic religions as the head of the archangels, is often depicted in art slaying the devil. Just as common are scenes showing Michael weighing souls with a scale on Judgment Day. These are antique banking scales, with two shallow pans dangling from opposite ends of a beam. Saint Michael holds the hooked pillar, allowing the pans to rise and fall depending on the weights placed on them. This saint's role as a judge to determine the net value of souls isn't mentioned in the Bible, but it demonstrates the popular perception of sin from the Middle Ages onwards. It's a debt that must be reconciled to enter heaven. Those who can't reconcile the debt go to purgatory, where their sins are paid off through unimaginable pain and suffering, equal to the remaining debt. If the balance sheet for a soul is too far in the red, hell is the final destination. The cost of sin would be painstakingly detailed in the centuries to come, so that penance doled out during the sacrament of confession would equal the sin for a zero-sum balance, a clean slate. Prior to reforms in the 16th century, fixed monetary values were also set by the Catholic Church to forgive sin. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II urged Christians to take up arms to retake the Holy Land from Muslim control. This was the First Crusade. To encourage as many people as possible to join the fight, he introduced the indulgence, the absolution of sin in exchange for an act or promise. The word comes from Latin, indulgeo. It means a kindness or the act of tenderness, which by Pope Urban's time morphed into forgiveness. From a dogmatic point of view, the transaction of the indulgence reduced or removed entirely any punishment required in purgatory. Once the terms of the indulgence were satisfied, the debt was paid. The indulgence granted by the Pope for participation in the crusade was called a plenary indulgence. Plenary means full, as in full and complete absolution of sins. Anyone who joined the fight and confessed their sins would receive this plenary indulgence. Making pilgrimages to the Holy Land and other sacred sites also earned indulgences, though not usually of the plenary kind. But what if you couldn't fight in a crusade? What if you were too unwell to journey as a pilgrim thousands of miles to receive an indulgence? Pope Urban II devised an ingenious solution. You could pay cash in lieu of the act, not directly, but as a donation to the church or to one of its charitable causes, perhaps to repair an old chapel, or, if you're wealthier, construct a brand new monastery. Donations of land and goods also had monetary value, tied directly to the length of the indulgence. By the 16th century, an indulgence was recorded by a legal document, a piece of paper that remitted a specific time in purgatory, years, decades, or more. The more you paid, the more time was shaved off. The more money you had, the more indulgences you could buy. Aristocrats benefited greatly from indulgences and were able to spare themselves centuries of suffering in the afterlife, as well as rescue already dead friends and family who could be plucked out of purgatory to heaven when enough cash was paid to the church to offset the debt of sin. The sale of indulgences by the church, which were granted at the sole discretion of the reigning pope, lasted for about half a century. This financial transaction for the absolution of sin was hotly criticized by many, not just by laypersons and secular bodies, but by voices from within the church as well. One of the most vocal was Martin Luther, a German priest and theologian born in 1483. It's difficult to overstate the incredible effect Martin Luther had on the modern face of Christianity and world history. Luther's efforts to reform the Church in Rome led to the Protestant Revolution, although it wasn't his intention to do anything but open a debate on a variety of church practices he found contradictory to Scripture. Chief among his criticisms was the sale of indulgences. For Martin Luther, the absolution of sin and salvation itself are gifts to be given by God alone. No human, be they a priest or the Pope, can possibly reconcile a sin on God's behalf, nor would any amount of cash spent on indulgences sway God's will on the matter. Luther argued that the Pope had no jurisdiction over souls in purgatory. It's impossible for mere humans to know the state of any souls after death, let alone a precise tally of the years they have left to suffer that can be converted into a monetary value for sale. Furthermore, if one can simply buy their way out of punishment for sin, there's no longer a need for contrition, penance, or good works of charity. No one with money would ever need to feel remorse or be sorry for anything they ever do, ever again. Luther publishes his criticisms on the sale of indulgences in the 1517 theological treatise 95 Theses. According to popular accounts, he posts the document on the door of All Saints' Church in Wittenberg. Luther is a professor of moral theology at the University of Wittenberg. It's a university custom to publicly post new ideas on every church door in the city to encourage discourse and debate. Luther also sends a copy to the Archbishop of Mainz. The point of the 95 Theses is to open public debate in an academic setting, a formal disputation. As already mentioned, Luther has no intention or thoughts of revolution. It's the Church that fires the first shot. Upon receiving Luther's theses, Albert of Brandenburg, the Archbishop of Mainz, confers with theologians at his local university. All agree that Luther ought to be immediately barred from criticizing indulgences in any way. Albert writes to the papacy for formal permission to enact this decision. Upon receiving the letter from Mainz, Pope Leo X takes the matter much more seriously. He identifies the 95 Theses and Martin Luther himself as grave threats. Here are some of the more provocative of Martin Luther's declarations. Number 22. As a matter of fact, the Pope remits to souls in purgatory no penalty which, according to canon law, they should have paid in this life. Number 26. The Pope does very well when he grants remission to souls in purgatory, not by the power of the keys which he does not have, but by way of intercession for them. Number 28. It is certain that when money clinks in the money chest, greed and avarice can be increased. But when the Church intercedes, The result is in the hands of God alone. Number 33. Those who believe that they can be certain of their salvation because they have indulgence letters will be eternally damned together with their teachers. A public relations battle ensues, with the publication of pamphlets refuting Luther and charges of heresy that interpret Luther's questioning of indulgences as a challenge to the Pope's authority, which seems to be the real crux of the issue. In 1521, Pope Leo X excommunicates Martin Luther. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V declares him an outlaw, an enemy of the state. Fleeing for his life, Luther survives under the protection of Frederick III, who's the secular leader of Saxony. Luther's ideas spread across Europe quickly with the help of a new technology from the East, the printing press, popularized by German inventor Johannes Gutenberg. Existing reform movements gain steam as a result. New ones, founded by charismatic leaders like John Calvin, proliferate, perhaps emboldened by Luther's work, as well as his subsequent success and survival. The rest is history. Pope Pius V would eventually abolish indulgences in 1567, 11 years after Martin Luther's death. All of this, which begins the breakup of one of the most formidable powers in Europe for centuries, because of the changing definition and understanding of sin. So where does sin come from? To answer this question, we have to take a trip to paradise. Hello, thank you for listening to Saint Podcast. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the podcast on Patreon. Your generosity will help keep the podcast going and fund future episodes and live events, as well as unlock access to bonus episodes and other exclusive content. Head to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/Saint Podcast. As always, Saint is spelled out. SAINT. Thank you again. We really appreciate your support. The story of Adam and Eve is told twice in Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the first book of the Christian Old Testament. The two retellings are referred to as Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 in reference to their chapter numbers. The Genesis 1 version of Adam and Eve is very short. On the fifth day, after creating the earth and all the plants and animals, God creates humans. Here is Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. According to Genesis 1, the first male and first female humans appear to be created at the same time, and they're both unnamed. The God of Genesis 1 is called Elohim, a plural Hebrew word that means gods, but is understood to refer to one God, the God of the Hebrew Bible. It's in Genesis 2 that the detailed story of Adam and Eve unfolds. It sort of follows on from Genesis 1 and explains how on the seventh day God rests. The God in Genesis 2 is referred to as Yahweh Elohim, or Lord God. At the start of Genesis 2, there aren't any plants or animals yet. Water wells up from the ground, which God uses to soak the surface of the dry planet. God then takes clay formed by the water and earth and shapes it into a male human. It's only when God, quote, blew into his nostrils the breath of life that the human becomes a living being. Once the first human, Adam, has been created, God covers the earth with plants. Adam settles into the Garden of Eden. He's to care for it, maintain and cultivate it. He's free to eat from any plant except for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God warns Adam that to eat the fruit of this tree is to die. Adam enjoys his life in paradise, but he's lonely. So God creates animals to keep him company, specifically, quote, various wild animals and various birds of the air. Interestingly, the fish mentioned several times in Genesis 1 aren't mentioned in this version of the creation tale. Adam befriends all the creatures and names them, but none are suitable partners. So God casts a deep sleep upon Adam and removes a rib, from which he fashions Eve, the first woman. Adam rejoices. This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of her man this one has been taken. This second human, created by God from the rib of the first, is at last a worthy partner for Adam. In the original Hebrew text, the word Adam has no gender. It simply means human. The word is closely linked to Adamah, another Hebrew term which means earth or clay. It describes the first human not as male, but made out of clay. Adam only becomes male, ish in Hebrew, when God creates Eve from his ribs. The Hebrew word for woman is isha, so the word for woman contains the word for man, as it does in English. A bit of clever wordplay and a subtle comment on gender that are lost in translation. Adam and Eve, the first man and woman, live in perfect harmony with their world. We're told they're unclothed, but unashamed of their nakedness. Everything is pure. The story, of course, doesn't end here. The third chapter of Genesis, or Genesis 3, describes what happens next. A snake convinces Eve to take a bite from the fruit taken from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. She then passes the fruit to Adam, who also takes a bite. The snake is popularly associated with the devil, Satan in a serpent's guise. This is a later addition to the Genesis story, added about 200 years later around 300 BCE. The original reading of the snake is as a symbol of temptation, likely tied to other Mesopotamian stories like Gilgamesh that feature snakes who deprive humanity of immortality. The forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is popularly portrayed as an apple. Biblical scholars continue to debate the specific fruit mentioned by the writer because the textual reference is simply the word fruit. Likely contenders are a fig, grapes, pomegranate, or the lemon-like citron fruit. The reason the unnamed fruit is so commonly depicted as an apple could be due to St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible, finished in the year 404, almost 1,000 years after the books comprising the Adam and Eve story were first written. Jerome translated the Hebrew word for fruit, pri, into the word malum, a Greek word borrowed by Latin speakers, which is also a generic term for fruit. But through the centuries, the word came to specifically mean apple. In fact, apple trees are categorized in the genus Malus, which comes from that Greek word malum. Coincidentally, the Latin word for evil is also malus. The English word malice comes from this Latin root word. Even though the Greek malum and the Latin malus sound similar, they're not related. That said, most people who read Jerome's translation of the Bible would have picked up on the similarities. An evil apple, a forbidden fruit. Once Adam and Eve have taken bites from the forbidden fruit, they realize they're naked and sew loincloths of fig leaves to cover themselves. They hide and cower when God approaches. He knows what they've done. He curses them with the pain and suffering of a mortal life and banishes them from paradise. Throughout history, the discourse on Adam and Eve has been, and continues to be, a battle between those who interpret the story literally and those who read it allegorically. The literal reading has its modern roots in the writings of Augustine of Hippo. Augustine is a saint, theologian, bishop, and hugely influential figure whose personal experiences with sin, especially lust, shaped his thoughts and those of Western civilization on Adam and Eve and sin. It was initially a figurative reading of Genesis that persuaded a 32-year-old Augustine, a devout Manichaean, to convert to Christianity. As a Manichaean, he had rejected the Jewish text as silly, totally full of contradictions. The compilation of Jewish texts and Christian writings known today as the Bible wouldn't be agreed upon for about 100 years after Augustine's death. It was Bishop Ambrose, another highly influential scholar, statesman, and saint, who persuaded Augustine that, like classical writings, the Jewish texts were nuanced, full of mystery, not to be read literally. After converting to Christianity, Augustine wrote a treatise in the year 388 called A Refutation of the Manichees that described the relevance of Adam and Eve through symbolism. By the year 400, however, just as he was completing his famous work, Confessions, Augustine's view had changed completely. Confessions presents the Garden of Eden and the expulsion of Adam and Eve as historic fact. Reading Augustine's work, as well as academic analyses of his writings, reveals he died still attempting to reconcile a literal interpretation of the Genesis story with passages that couldn't possibly be meant literally. Or could they? It's Augustine's literal interpretation of Adam and Eve that survives today. And it's this viewpoint that lies at the foundation of moves to ban evolutionary theory and other branches of science in schools, the regulation of sex and sexual behavior, misogynistic viewpoints on women, and scriptural justification for why we should protect or exploit the natural world. Whether your interpretation of the Adam and Eve story is literal or allegorical, sin is born from the moment Adam and Eve took bites from the forbidden fruit. This sin, the guilt all humans bear and inherit, is what Christians call original sin, a term coined by St. Augustine. For Christians, scriptural evidence for original sin and our inherently evil natures comes from Psalm 51:5. I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Lucas Cranach, one of the leading figures of the German Renaissance, painted several Adam and Eve works. The nude figures of Adam, always on the left, and Eve on the right, sport leaves to cover their genitalia. They stand beneath an apple tree and hold one apple. Sometimes they both touch it, other times it's only Eve or Adam who carries it in their hand. The paintings depict the moments before they commit the act that results in expulsion from the garden, the event that gives birth to sin, which the faithful call the fall. The York Art Gallery has a Lucas Cranach on display at the Sin exhibition. It's not of Adam and Eve, but of Venus and Cupid. Venus is nude like Eve, but her nudity isn't a modest one. She isn't covered up by leaves. Venus is the goddess of love, an overtly erotic figure. She stands in a pose very similar to that of Eve, with a small winged Cupid in the place of Adam. The inscription on Venus's hat in the painting at the York Art Gallery is a quote from the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, "All is vanity." I spoke with Morgan Feely, acting curator at the York Art Gallery, about the exhibition Sin.
Hi, I'm Morgan Feely. I'm acting senior curator at York Art Gallery. I'm actually here on a maternity cover post, so the organisation had already made the decision to take the Sin exhibition before I started at the gallery, but I was very pleased about that because I had seen this exhibition when it was at the National Gallery. It's a partnership between York Art Gallery, which is part of York Museums Trust, and the National Gallery, which had shown it as a free exhibition in 2020. The exhibition has been curated by Dr Joost Joustra at the National Gallery and came as a touring package of 8 exceptional paintings from the National Gallery, plus 2 contemporary loans, to which we were free to add some works of our own and some other content.
Along with artworks on loan from the National Gallery London were several pieces from the York Art Gallery's own collection, as well as pieces commissioned for the exhibition. One artist in particular has a special connection to the York Art Gallery, which has a collecting strand themed around the body. This artist's work also has links to the topic of the exhibition itself. Here's Morgan to tell us more.
York's most famous artist was a Victorian painter called William Etty. Etty, working in the academic tradition, painted what's called history painting, so particularly scenes from biblical history, classical history. They were meant to be elevating, ennobling stories in which the human figure, often painted nude, was central. But Etty became criticised later as his career progressed for having too much focus on the nude body, and that instead of elevating, his work provoked lascivious thoughts. So he found himself out of sync increasingly with Victorian morality.
Morgan mentions the quality some artworks have to inspire sin, specifically the paintings of York artist William Etty, born in 1787. One of Etty's lust-inducing paintings is included in the Sin exhibition.
We have a painting that, if not by Etty himself, duplicates a composition that he showed at the Royal Academy called Venus and Her Satellites. We included this one in particular because it's one of the works that Etty received a mixed reception. On the one hand, it was seen as beautiful. It shows Venus and her attendants and Mars, who has sort of passed out in a slumber after, we assume, a night of making love in front of a sort of temple setting. It was admired for the skill with which it was painted, but it was also condemned for provoking lustful thoughts, for inspiring the wrong kind of ideas in the viewer. Because in the first gallery we have a wonderful Lucas Cranach painting of Venus, we thought that Venus was quite a good figure to include. We really wanted to encourage people to make connections between the works from the National Gallery and York's own works, between the contemporary works and the historic works. And we tried to do that in a few situations.
Etty's paintings were initially celebrated, then derided for their revival of classical nudity, condemned for inspiring one of the 7 deadly sins, lust. For Christians, the 7 deadly sins, also known as the capital or cardinal sins, lie at the roots of all evil committed by humankind. The 7 deadly sins are lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. The 7 deadly sins aren't in the Bible. Their origins can be traced to ancient Greek writings. The philosopher Aristotle described virtues as qualities that sit between extremes. For example, temperance is a virtue that sits in the middle of a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is an excess of temperance, which results in insensitivity, a harmful joylessness unable to be stimulated by anything. An absence of temperance, intemperance, which lies on the other end of the spectrum, results in profligacy, unrestrained recklessness. Courage is another example. A complete lack of courage is cowardice. An extreme excess of courage is a destructive foolishness, arrogant and thoughtless. The modern 7 deadly sins grew out of these classical ideas about virtues and vice, and were incorporated into Christian thought by the Desert Fathers of 3rd century Egypt. St. Anthony of Egypt, whom we met in the first Mystics episode, is one of these Desert Fathers. In the 14th century, the poet and author Dante defined the 7 deadly sins as corruptions of love. He identified pride as the most deadly sin of all, the one that fuels all others. One painting at the York Art Gallery Sin exhibition is a catalogue of all 7 deadly sins. It's painted by Jan Steen and called The Effects of Intemperance.
This painting shows a disorderly household. In Dutch still today, apparently, a Jan Steen household is an expression that means a sort of drunken, disorderly household. The mother of the house is falling asleep in a drunken slumber, and her kids are getting up to all kinds of mischief around her. And there's a strain of Dutch 17th century painting that shows how the bad behavior of the parents is passed on to the children. And so you get a sort of self-perpetuating cycle of sin, essentially. Her children are doing all sorts of naughty things. One is picking her pockets. One is feeding wine to a parrot. The parrot is a symbol of imitation. It's a reference to the fact that children imitate their parents' behavior. boys are feeding a meat pie to a cat. Another is throwing roses in front of a pig, which is a Dutch expression apparently akin to our throwing pearls before swine. In this painting, we can see that life has taken a wrong turn for the mother. In the background, hanging up behind her, there is a basket and a crutch and clappers, which are the accoutrements of a beggar in 17th century Holland. So we're maybe led to believe that he's going to go further downhill and end up on the street. And in the foreground, there's an overturned wine jug, bread discarded on the floor. Those are Eucharistic symbols, of course, the bread and the wine of Holy Communion, which represent the body and blood of Christ. Obviously, alcohol has played a part in her downfall. It may not be the only thing, and in the background there's a little vignette of a man and a woman at a table, a scene of seduction, and it's tempting to speculate that this might be the woman earlier in life. What's physically in the background is her metaphorical background. Further in the background is a church which is being ignored. So it's not an overtly religious painting at all. It's a secular painting, but it's still set against this backdrop of religious belief.
Jan Steen was a satirist. His artwork was a commentary on 17th century society. The sins portrayed in The Effects of Intemperance would have been seen by many contemporaries as an indictment not of the people committing the sins, but the system that perpetuated these cycles of sin. Many of the artworks at the York Art Gallery exhibition challenge the viewer to discern the sin being committed and by whom. One particularly moving piece is called Youth, by an artist named Ron Muick.
Ron Muick is an Australian sculptor who did a residency at the National Gallery. He makes sculpture usually of the human body. What's distinctive about it is that it's very often over or under scale. And that gives it a kind of really compelling, uncanny quality because the sculpture is so realistic that we're kind of convinced that what we're seeing is a real person, but the scale is wrong and tells us that it can't be. Youth shows a young black man in jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot, lifting up his white t-shirt to reveal a stab wound in his side. And he's looking down at it in a kind of disbelief. And I think this sculpture has two key influences. So the first is that it was made in response to Muick's period of work as artist in residence at the National Gallery. And he was looking a lot at images of Christ and images that show the wounds of Christ. And we have a couple of works in the exhibition that have a focus on Christ's wounds. Muick was interested in depictions of Christ in the National Gallery's collection that had an emphasis on his wounds. The youth's wound in his side is in exactly the place where Christ's side wound is usually depicted as being. So this is the wound that he was given by a Roman soldier with a long spear while he was on the cross. It's the wound that in the famous Caravaggio depiction of Doubting Thomas, we see Thomas putting his finger into the wound. Muick must also have been very aware while he was working at the National Gallery, and I can imagine him leaving in the evening and picking up an Evening Standard and the stories being about knife crime. It seems he was struck by a kind of scapegoating. This is how I read it, a scapegoating of young black men, so that the way stabbings were reported showed little sympathy for the victims. So it seems Muick is drawing a kind of analogy between the youth in the sculpture and the figure of Christ. If we go down that road, he's really asking us to question our assumptions, look again at our stereotypes, think about societal scapegoating, think about how we end up with cycles of violence and sin, and how we break those cycles.
Ron Muick's sculpture, Youth, demonstrates how even the concept of the scapegoat, originally an actual goat who carried away a community's sins, has evolved into an expression to describe someone blamed for the sins of another. The mix of contemporary and old masters' works in the exhibition invites the viewer to examine their personal beliefs around sin. It's the contemporary pieces in particular, such as Youth, that most viscerally provoke this questioning, perhaps inviting us to forgive rather than condemn the alleged sinners. The foundations of the Christian faith are on forgiveness. Christ dying on the cross is an act of sacrifice that Christians believe reversed the curse placed on humanity by Adam and Eve's expulsion. His wounds, the holy wounds we discussed in the Saint Podcast Halloween episode, appear in countless works of art, including a 15th century altarpiece panel on display at the Sin exhibition. The wounds symbolize the redemption of humanity. Christ's death, his blood, are a sacrifice that forgives humans for Adam and Eve's sin, allowing the faithful to return once again to paradise, enter heaven after death. The forgiveness of sin is perhaps best illuminated by the most famous sinner, who famously repented to become one of the most popular saints, Mary Magdalene. It's a painting of St. Mary Magdalene that opens the Sin exhibition, and whose image adorns the posters and ads all over the city of York.
The painting that we open the show with is a copy, it's thought, of a lost Van Dyck original from the second half of the 17th century. Our painting seems to be not too far in date and very close in composition to the missing original. It shows Mary Magdalene in the wilderness with a skull and a book in front of her, so she's reflecting on morality and the holy texts. She is rolling her eyes up to heaven or looking up to heaven. Her eyes are red from crying, so she's repentant. She's thinking about her sins. What we know about her from the Gospels is kind of built on in legend afterwards, so that the overall picture is that she is a woman who had given her body to pleasure, it's said, and maybe even to prostitution. But then she had repented of her sins, become a disciple of Christ, and she's there at his crucifixion. We can usually recognize her by her long hair, her often to some extent nakedness, or she often has a red robe sort of falling off her shoulders suggestively. The red of Christ's blood is the same as the red of her robe, so there's a sort of connection there to do with redemption. Mary Magdalene is a figure who kind of encompasses the themes of the exhibition in some way, because she's a sinner who repents and is forgiven. Sin and repentance is really what it's all about.
The appeal of Mary Magdalene lies in her repentance, that she sinned and was forgiven, transformed from a fallen woman into one of Christ's closest confidants. Her reputation as a sex worker is a common misconception. It's a detail added in the 6th century by a saint and pope, Gregory the Great, who confused Mary Magdalene with another biblical figure named Mary from the Gospel of Luke. The idea stuck, however, and proliferated in art. As Cardinal Gianfranco Ravasi, the Vatican's culture minister, said in 2018, art history made her become a prostitute, which is something that is not present in the Gospels. In 1969, the Catholic Church officially revised the prostitute designation. And in 2016, Pope Francis took the biggest step yet to rehabilitate the maligned sinner by elevating Mary Magdalene's memorial to a feast day on par with other holy days in honor of the apostles and the most popular saints. Jennifer Restina, director of the Magdalena Institute at Magdala, neatly summarizes the transformation. Historical tradition says she was a prostitute from Magdala. Reanalyzing that reputation she had, we can see she was probably a woman of a higher social status, who accompanied Jesus, as we see in Luke chapter 8, verse 2, helping Jesus and his disciples with her own resources. Contemporary interpretations of the sinner-turned-saint reveal an influential disciple who supported Christ, both spiritually and financially. We'll explore the legend of St. Mary Magdalene in a future series dedicated to her. Like the modern perception of St. Mary Magdalene, modern viewpoints concerning sin have also changed. The York Art Gallery commissioned a series of artworks from a summer program run by the museum called Teenage Art School.
Every year, York Art Gallery runs a program called Teenage Art School during the summer, and we invite young people to come and spend the week at the gallery doing an artist-led program of workshops. What we try to do is to capture what they do in some way and have some kind of output. The young people who took part were so engaged and so eloquent. It was a great opportunity to bring in different voices talking about the theme of sin. Having said all that, I think the theme of sin is quite a tricky one. And we spent some time thinking really about how that would be addressed. We worked with partners Mediale, which is a York-based organization that principally works in digital arts, but also increasingly in engagement. The workshops were led by a practitioner called Rachel Briscoe from Fast Familiar, who did an absolutely wonderful job getting them to think about the theme of sin, but quite broadly. So I went in and talked to the participants about some of the works in the exhibition, but also talked much more broadly about issues of morality. They also talked about their approaches to making art and what it meant to them in their lives. And then they spent some time in the studio making plasticine sculptures, which they then 3D scanned, which was quite exciting. So they were engaging with that really cutting edge technology. But also they went out into the museum gardens, they took photographs and shot bits of film. And then they were themselves filmed talking about their thoughts on art making, on sin, on some of the issues, things like knife crime or climate change. The young artists were a real range of ages, I think from 13 to 17. How they responded depends, I guess, at what stages in their own formative years they are and what influences they're seeing outside of teenage art school, what they're watching at home and everything. So yeah, it was by turns charming, moving, thought-provoking, powerful. I think it's an absolutely wonderful project, and we'll continue to do it every year.
For the teenaged artists in this program, sin inspired creations about crime, mental health, climate change, rather than traditional depictions of, say, Adam and Eve or the 7 deadly sins. One of the 3D printed sculptures was a bloody knife, another a foot stamping on a prone body. One artist created 3 animal figures, a rooster, a snake, and a pig. Each animal represents one of the 3 Buddhist poisons, or 3 unwholesome roots of all bad behavior. The rooster represents greed and sensual attachment, the snake, malice and hate, and the pig, delusion, confusion. Other contemporary works in the Sin exhibition also reveal the ever-evolving definition of sin. One such work is a video installation by Gilbert and George that challenges 20th century notions of good behavior. A besuited Gilbert and George sit facing each other at a table, which stands in front of a window of what looks like a perfectly respectable lounge room. They take turns sipping from glasses full of gin, whilst a voiceover, "Gordon's Makes Us Drunk," which is also the title of the piece, plays repeatedly. In the context of the Sin exhibition, visitors consider the sin being committed by 2 seemingly mainstream, reasonably well-to-do gentlemen in suits. Are they respectable, though, if they're taking non-stop sips of gin? Anyone familiar with Gilbert and George will know they're a same-sex couple. Is their very presence in this 1972 work example of sin? Do we in the 21st century feel the same way? Here's Morgan to tell us about a Tracey Emin piece from the exhibition.
One work that I wanted to mention is Tracey Emin's neon text piece, which says it was just a kiss. Emin is famous for making confessional, in the broadest sense, work that talks about her own life and her experiences. Most famously, maybe her bed with all the objects and detritus of her life scattered around and over it. She's also made a series of neon text pieces, and this one, It Was Just a Kiss, can be read in a few different ways. So perhaps it's one partner confessing to another of some kind of infidelity, but justifying it and saying, look, it's not that bad. I still love you. It was only a kiss. Another way that the National Gallery's curator, Joost Joustra, suggested we might interpret it was as the kiss that Judas betrayed Christ with. Judas betrays Christ to the Romans by walking up to him and giving him a kiss, and in return receives his silver. I guess that's not the most straightforward expected reading of the piece, so we thought, how do we tease that out a little? And the first work that you encounter as you move from the space that's in into the space next door is a painting of the betrayal of Christ by a 20th century British artist called Carol Waite. Waite depicts the moment that Christ is betrayed by a kiss, except he transports it to the Crystal Palace in South London, to his own time in the early 1950s. And in the painting, the Roman soldiers are wearing the uniforms of German Nazi soldiers of World War II, which gives it, again, a slightly surreal quality.
One of the last pieces at the York Art Gallery exhibition is by an artist named Zara Worth. I found myself interacting with it, though unsure if what I wanted to do was allowed, so I waited till the invigilator and other visitors left the room.
Zara Worth is a young artist who's currently completing a PhD at Leeds Beckett University. She grew up not far from York, so York Art Gallery was her home art gallery as a kid. She's an artist on the rise. Her work very often deals with themes around value systems. She's interested in religious iconography, which often appears in her work, but she's also interested in online communities and how people behave and react to each other online, and how we use our smartphones and tablets and so on, and perhaps how both religious art and tech can be thought of as kind of portals. And we're looking for transcendence, we're looking for redemption, we're looking for meaning. So she made a wonderful sculpture which has three elements. It has two portal or door-like shapes, which are actually the shapes of mobile phones, picked out in neon. It's not real neon, it's fake neon. She's quite interested in using fake or ersatz materials. And although it doesn't say you can, she's quite interested in seeing if gallery visitors are cheeky enough to walk through those doorways. The other element is a large, thin polyester sheet that hangs suspended from the ceiling. Zara has painted on it with fake gold. It's, again, ersatz material. It's not the real gilding. She has used elements from the architecture of York Minster, elements from Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise in Florence, so a Renaissance masterpiece that appears down one side of the sheet, and then on the other side, Rodin's Gates of Hell, which is a project that Rodin, the sculptor, spent a long time thinking about and making. And then there are lots of gesturing hands, and the hands come from religious icons, but they also come from social media. And in both cases, Zara is interested in how people, figures in paintings or people on social media, point at who's most important in the picture and why are they doing these things. There's two little cutout holes you can peep through, like a seaside cutout thing, which give you a halo. But they look also like the little ticking circles that appear on your phone as you wait for something to download. So we've got all these references going on, which I think you would never necessarily totally unpick.
So it turns out I was allowed to walk through the mobile phone screen portal, which raises some moral questions. I thought walking through was prohibited, but I did it anyway. I made a decision to break a rule, to commit a sin, but do so in a way that I wouldn't get caught. Since what I did is actually allowed, did I commit a sin? Does intention have more bearing or weight in the classical sense of sin than the actual rules? For Christians, behavior is guided by ever-changing concepts of sin and a set of rules called the Ten Commandments. These rules, which, according to Jewish texts, were revealed by God to the prophet Moses, inscribed miraculously on 2 stone tablets. The 10 Commandments are open to interpretation. Even the ones that are quite clear and concrete, such as "Thou shalt not kill," accommodate passionate beliefs for Christians on all sides of the political spectrum to support or condemn euthanasia, capital punishment, abortion rights, war. The Sin exhibition at the York Art Gallery encourages visitors to contemplate behavior and morality. Walking through the exhibition revealed to me personally that reality is rarely as simple as good versus evil, virtue versus vice. Perhaps these pairings of opposites are further examples of binary models that no longer suit 21st century experiences. I'd like to end on another biblical passage that speaks to being good and avoiding sin. This one's from the New Testament. It's called the Golden Rule, a guideline proclaimed by Christ according to the Gospel of Matthew. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode, It's a Sin, an exploration of sin inspired by the York Art Gallery exhibition. If you're planning to be in the UK in January of 2023, make time to check it out. It's an excellent exhibition at a great museum. Special thanks to acting curator Morgan Feely for making the time to chat with me about the exhibition and museum. Big thanks also to Shona McElworth from the communications team for making this podcast happen and for showing me around the fascinating York Castle Museum. The Castle Museum and the Art Gallery in York are both worth a visit when you're next in the UK. And lastly, thank you to Richard Saward of York Museums Trust and museum mover and shaker Mar Dixon for connecting me with the right people to make this all happen. For images of the artworks, people, and topics mentioned in the episode, please have a look at the Saint Podcast website at www.saintpodcast.com. The word saint is spelled out, S-A-I-N-T. Do also check out the York Art Gallery's website for additional info about the exhibition Sin, which runs till the end of January 2023. Follow the York Art Gallery on Twitter and Instagram at York Art Gallery. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for future special Saint Podcast episodes.